Hello, and welcome to the eOrganic webinar on stockpiling forages to extend the grazing season. My name is Deb Haliba, and I work at the University of Vermont Extension as eOrganic's Dairy Team Coordinator. eOrganic is an online community of more than 700 ag service providers and farmers who are providing science, experience, and regulation-based certified organic information on the web. Together we publish articles, videos, and other content at eextension.org. This webinar is part of an ongoing series offered by eOrganic's Dairy Team. You can see more information about these webinars and find the recording of today's session, which includes the webinar recording, a PDF of the slides that Laura will use in her presentation today, and as well as an article that Laura wrote on today's topic. And view our other content on our website at www.eextension.org/organic_production. Before we get started, I wanted to give you a quick rundown of today's webinars. Laura will give her presentation for about 45 minutes. Then we will ask you to respond to a few quick poll questions that will pop up on your screen. And then next we will hold a question and answer session for about 30 minutes. If at any time you have a question, you can simply type it into the question box on your screen and hit return. If for some reason you can't see the question box, just click on the small plus sign next to the word question on your control panel to open it up. And we'll answer as many questions as we have time for. And then finally, we ask that you respond to an email you will receive following the webinar to complete a follow-up survey. Okay, I would now like to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Laura Paine is a grazing and organic agriculture specialist with the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture. There she helps develop markets for organic and grass-fed products. In addition, Laura has nearly 20 years experience conducting grazing research and education at the University of Wisconsin and UW Extension. She has served on several organic and grazer advisory teams, including Grassworks, a farmer-led pasture group, and the Wisconsin Organic Advisory Council. In addition, as you see pictured here, she and her husband raise grass-fed beef on their farm near Columbus, Wisconsin. Laura, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today and look forward to having some question and answer later as well. I wanted to start by just giving you a little bit of a caveat on the topic. The stockpiling is a practice that is really about pasture management, and it's fairly generic in terms of what classes of livestock this will work for. So you'll see some slides of beef cattle in the presentation, and certainly the information that I share will be usable by people in addition to dairy folks, beef, sheep, and other classes of livestock. So the key is really talking about extending the grazing season. And one of the most important things, rationales for doing this, is really economics. In my part of the world and across the Northeast and Midwest, we really only have good pasture growth for maybe 5, 6, or 7 months of the year, and stored winter feed is one of our largest expenses. The data you see on the screen here for costs of hay production versus hay purchase and pasture production are from a study we did of grass-fed and organic beef production in 3 states in the Midwest in the last few years. As you can see, our pasture production is significantly cheaper. It's always cheaper to let your cows do the harvesting. So for any weeks or months that we can extend that grazing season, we're going to put more money in our pockets. Okay, and the concept is really to store the forage in the field until winter. So this diagram that you see on the screen, we will be looking at a few more times throughout the presentation. We basically start here in August or so, give or take a few weeks, and I'll talk about the pros and cons of starting earlier or later. And the forage at this time of year is generally all vegetative. It's relatively high quality, and we can grow it through the late fall into early winter. And then it maintains pretty high quality into early winter, November, December. After that, the quality declines somewhat. And then this is the concept that you can use at different times of the year, and especially in areas where we have a late summer drought, people might want to think about stockpiling for summer feeding as well. It's basically just resting the pasture for a longer period of time and then going in and grazing it later. Okay, so while I was at UW back in the 90s, we conducted a very comprehensive study of about 6 different species over 3 sites with a number of different other variables. And so that'll be the basis of a lot of the slides. But there are also a number of other studies that have been done since then and before then. And I've got this list of references in the paper that's posted on the website. So we won't go into detail on that right now, but I will be referring to some of those studies as we go forward. One of the other good reasons to use stockpiling, in addition to the economics, is to help even out the pasture yield throughout the year. As you see in this little graph, the cool season pastures that are most common in a large part of the country have a large spurt of growth in the spring, and that growth represents 50 to 60% of the pasture yield. So anything we can do to spread out that yield over the year and take advantage of this later summer spurt of growth is going to help us have plenty of forage for our cattle throughout the year. Okay, so in general, October through December stockpiling periods are very doable. We have maintained high quality throughout that period, and the yield is maintained. I know of a number of people who also graze stockpile starting in March or even February farther south from here, but what you see during that period is a reduction in quality and yield, so that's a little bit more questionable. The mechanism that we use for fall stockpiling is, as I mentioned, taking advantage of this fall bump in growth of cool season grasses. What makes this effective is the presence of 2 requirements. Those are nitrogen and water. And depending on the season and fertilizer or fertility availability, the results you get are going to vary dramatically. And I'll show you some data that kind of gives us the range of what's possible. Okay, so in very general terms, looking over all of the 6 or 8 studies that I reviewed, we can expect about 1 ton to 1.5 tons of dry matter per acre with no nitrogen fertilizer or irrigation when we stockpile starting in August and utilize the forage in late October. If you apply nitrogen fertilizer, and the recommendation is about 60 pounds per acre of actual N, you can increase to 1.8 to 2.7 tons of dry matter per acre. And then if you add irrigation or regular moisture, adequate moisture, you can increase that even further to 2 to 2.5 tons per acre of dry matter. So that's what the research tells us is possible. As far as the quality of that forage goes, what I found in these studies was a huge range of forage qualities. The crude proteins ranged everywhere from actually below 11% up to 19%, and TDN, or total digestible nutrients, ranged from 59% up to 74%. So depending on the class of livestock that you're managing and feeding, you'd probably want to actually do some testing and look at what you have and how you need to supplement that with grain or stored feed, other forages. I do know that the dairy farmers that I've worked with here in Wisconsin have been able to exceed the levels that are reported in the literature for whatever reason, I don't know. And commonly, early winter stockpiled forage here in the state anyway can run 20 to 25% food protein and greater than 150 relative forage quality. So I think with good management and the right conditions, you can provide very adequate pasture forage as high a quality as any time during the regular grazing season. Okay, so here are just some general results of the studies that we looked at. For pasture species, the grasses across all of the studies that seem to perform the best are tall fescue and orchard grass. The tall fescue, there are basically two types that are out there. There's an endophyte infected type that is very common throughout the Mid-South region. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of. That variety of tall fescue does have some, bring with it some animal health issues because of the endophyte and the toxins that it produces in the plant's tissue. The one good thing about tall fescue is that it is absolutely the best stockpiling grass out there, the endophyte infective type. It tends to have more growth in the fall, and it also has a very upright, waxy leaf that maintains the quality and the yield through the harsher weather that we get in the winter. A good alternative are the endophyte-free tall fescues that are out there on the market now. They don't perform quite as well under stockpiling conditions, but we certainly wouldn't recommend the endophyte infected over those endophyte-free ones. So tall fescue is a very good species for this. Orchard grass is another one that stands up well under stockpiling. For legumes, generally the recommendation is that legumes don't hold up very well under stockpiling conditions because of leaf loss over the winter. But in an organic situation where you don't have a lot of options for nitrogen fertilization, I think it would be advisable to select pastures that do have legumes in it. And what we've seen in the research is that alfalfa and birdfoot trefoil perform the best under these circumstances. Okay. So what we see, here's some of the research from Wisconsin. These are stockpile yields in tons per acre of dry matter. These plots were started stockpiling on August 1st, and as you can see, they average right around 1 to 1.2 tons per acre across the species. There were a couple of studies that I looked at that were under irrigation, and here's one of them that was actually conducted in Utah, but it has some of the same species, so we can kind of compare where we're looking at 1 to 1.2 tons per acre, unirrigated. We can pretty much double that yield under irrigation. So the moisture availability during that stockpiling period is can make a huge difference in the amount of yield that we have. And then the studies that did look at legumes had some interesting results. There's a study in Nebraska that showed that alfalfa and birdfoot trefoil performed the best, as I mentioned before, 1.2 to 1.4 tons per acre. These are solid stands of the legume. They did look at some of the clover species and found that those species tend to lose a lot of leaves and a lot of dry matter, even during the short period between frost and when the cattle are put on those pastures. So we don't recommend stands with a lot of clover in them for stockpiling. There's also a study that looked at the regular upright alfalfa versus grazing alfalfa, and as you can see, the upright alfalfa performed much better, as you might expect, because of what makes a good stockpiling species is the plant being able to hold itself upright and not collapse under the weight of snow or other climatic conditions. So the grazing alfalfa, while it might be the best in a summer grazing situation, it's not necessarily what's going to work best for stockpiling. Okay, so let's look at some of the other variables. We know that the nitrogen and moisture are two key variables that influence the amount of yield and the quality of those stockpiled pastures. There are some other variables. This study is from Western Canada, so we'll have to take that as a caveat here. But it was the one that looked at the widest range of start dates. And the start date that we recommend here in Wisconsin is August 1st. This one went back to July 1st and one more date after the 1st of August. But as you can see, the main take-home message here is the later you go in the season, the less forage accumulation you're going to have, which is kind of common sense. But this was the case across all of the species, as you can see here, but possibly less so for some of the species than others. But in general, the farther back in the season you go, the more yield you'll have going into the stockpiling grazing period. However, just like during the regular grazing season, there's a trade-off between yield and quality. And this study, which was conducted in Nebraska, shows they looked at two stockpiling dates. They had July 15th and August 15th. And as you can see, the July 15th timing yielded significantly more yield, but you lost a couple of percentage points in crude protein, and you lost some dry matter digestibility. So this is a case where you'd want to look at the class of livestock you are planning on grazing on these stockpiled pastures and make a determination of whether you're going for quality or tonnage. Okay, here in Wisconsin, we recommend 50 to 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre for maximizing your stockpile yield. And this is some data from the study we did back in the 90s, where we looked at a no added nitrogen treatment, the 60 pounds that I just mentioned, and then this 150 pounds was a split application throughout the growing season. So there were three 50-pound applications in early summer, midsummer, and just as the stockpile period began. As you can see, the 60 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer in general added an average of 68% in yield of dry matter. And beyond that, the additional fertilizer applications earlier in the season didn't have an effect on yield significantly. So if your focus is stockpile, adding some stockpile yield in the fall, one application of nitrogen just as you start that stockpiling period is adequate. Later in the talk, I'll talk a little bit about nitrogen sources and what some of the trade-offs with organic nitrogen sources that you might want to consider. Okay, and then the other issue we have, in addition to the the timing of the stockpiling, the role of moisture and the role of nitrogen, is the timing of the grazing of that stockpiled forage. And generally, the most common time frame for stockpiling in the the northern tier of states here in the U.S. Would be between October and December, probably would be the limits. At least here in Wisconsin, once you get snow cover or ice on the ground, you've basically ended the grazing season for the year. And then here in Wisconsin, you can people do stockpile or graze stockpiled forage starting in March. But there are significant declines in both yield and quality when after the stockpile has gone through the winter. So this graph here just shows the documentation of those declines. Here's our tall fescue at the top here. As we noted in previous slides, it does yield about the best of any of the grasses that we have, cool season grasses we have in this part of the country. But it declines over the winter just as all of the other species do. What we saw in the study that we did was an average of about 23% decline in yield between October and December, and then another 24% decline between December and March. So between the time that your stockpiled pasture is done growing in October and the following spring, you've lost almost half of the tonnage that's out there just through decomposition of leaves. Then we also see declines in quality of the stockpiled forage over the winter. And these are some data from Nebraska again. This was under irrigation. And they saw between November and February a decline of about 2 to 3 percentage points in crude protein, and then a decline of about 10% in vitro dry matter digestibility. And that's basically what we see in all the studies is, as I mentioned, as the forage goes through the winter, the rain and snow and other climate conditions really have an effect on the amount of nutrition in that forage. And I would note that the legume forage quality, which was looked at in some of the studies, started out significantly higher than the grasses, but it did decline much more rapidly as the leaves fell off of those legume plants. Okay, so you might want to ask yourself, how many acres do I need to set aside if I do want to do some stockpiling and extend my grazing season into the fall or winter? What we recommend to people here in Wisconsin, and you'd probably want to adjust that depending on where in the country you are and what your forage yields are in your part of the world, but here in Wisconsin, we recommend that people have on their farm about 2 acres per animal unit, and an animal unit is considered 1,000 pounds of animal, and that should provide enough forage for pasturing during the summer and haymaking during the winter. So if you don't have that sort of forage base to work with, it's going to be hard to set aside some acres for stockpiling if you're getting some of your forage needs provided from off-farm. But if you do have enough acres to provide for forage year-round for your herd, then it should be fairly simple to modify your management of some of those acres to, instead of cut them for hay and feed them in the barn, have your animals actually graze those acres later into the winter. The way to calculate, just to get started on providing for your animals' forage needs through stockpiling, is to start by thinking in terms of the notion that they consume about 3% of their body weight in dry matter per day. And especially on a dairy farm, part of that 3% is probably consumed in stored feeds if you feed a TMR, or if you feed some silage or grain or any of those supplements. Those are all part of that 3%. But let's assume for now that we're going to provide all that 3% of body weight as pasture. We have a 1,200-pound cow. She needs about 36 pounds a day, or about 1,080 pounds per month. So if we have a 100-cow herd of 1,200-pound dairy cows, you multiply that out to 1,080 for a month by your 100 cows, and you end up needing about 54 tons of dry matter. At 1.2 tons per acre, which is kind of the average of what we saw in these studies that we could accumulate during a stockpiling period, you would need about 45 acres for a month of grazing on that farm. So as you plan your stockpiling, you would, you'd think about where am I going to set aside those acres to extend the grazing season, whether it be a month or 2 months, based on some of these ballpark figures. And then you'd probably want to also think in terms of species composition of the pasture. Do you have some pastures that are predominantly tall fescue or orchard grass? Do you have some that have some good alfalfa stands in them? Those would be the ones that tend to perform the best under stockpiling and might be the ones that you'd want to set aside. Okay, and then I wanted to talk for a few minutes about nitrogen fertility, because we don't have the kinds of nitrogen fertilizers that really work well with pastures available for organic farms. And this makes a huge difference in the forage yield and accumulation that we can get. Nitrogen sources that we could consider, of course, include manure. If we look at about 3 to 5 pounds of nitrogen per ton, we would need 12 to 20 tons per acre to provide the level of fertility that's recommended. Compost, I couldn't find real good numbers, but these are the numbers that came off the internet. 12 pounds of nitrogen per ton for dairy manure. That means we'd need about 5 tons per acre. Composted poultry manure was a little higher, 17 pounds, which would give us 3.5 tons per acre. We have fish-based fertilizers that, with a 500 analysis, we would need about 1,200 pounds per acre of those. And there's really no research out there on the effectiveness of organic nitrogen sources like these in spurring stockpile pasture growth. And I suspect that these being all slow release sources, we wouldn't get the same sort of response. Using these manures and compost are certainly a good idea on pastures, but I'm just not, I wouldn't consider the results that we've seen in the studies to be applicable in these situations. The other fertilizer that's available, and I know that it's under it's being looked at as not necessarily the best fertilizer choice for organics, but it is out there, the Chilean nitrate, which is 1600. And I just came across a price online of $953 a ton. That would give us about $180 per acre in a 60-pound nitrogen per acre application, which would come up to about $150 to $180 per ton of additional yield. So that would be a way of kind of assessing whether you wanted to use this source or not. I think probably the most useful fertility management approach for stockpiling, as well as for pasture management in general on an organic farm, is to really focus on creating an effective nutrient distribution system. And your manure spreaders, of course, are these animals right here. And working with them and managing them on your property is probably the best way to ensure that nutrients are cycling effectively. And this is actually my husband here, and this 80-acre piece on the screen is my own farm, and I thought I would use that as an example of how we manage our system for effective nutrient distribution. Okay, one of the keys, of course, is legumes, and there are a lot of reasons for having legumes in your pastures, whether or not they perform well under stockpiling, and the main one is their role in providing nitrogen fixation, and the nitrogen is then available to the grasses in the system. These are just some numbers of the capacity of nitrogen fixation of some of our primary legumes. Alfalfa and trefoil were identified as some of the better species for stockpiling, and clearly alfalfa outperforms all of the other legume choices in terms of its ability to fix nitrogen and actually make it available to the grasses that it's planted with. So it has several strong benefits for a stockpiling system. And of course, most of the nitrogen that's fixed by legumes in our pastures get back into the system by being consumed and redeposited by our animals. So where we put those animals and how we move them around the farm is going to dramatically impact how well fertilized the pastures are. And of course, this assumes that we're using management-intensive grazing, and obviously, as you move from one big pasture with no rest period and no divisions toward a system that's common on a lot of managed grazing dairy farms, which involves often moving your herd to a new paddock every 12 hours. You're moving toward not only better nutrient distribution, but higher quality yield and diversity of those pastures. We can do some other management practices to maintain good nutrient cycling. And the general rule of thumb here is that any practice that we can do on the pasture rather than in the barn or in the holding area is going to increase the amount of manure distribution that occurs on pasture and reduce our need to mechanically collect and spread manure. So feeding on pasture, if you feed a supplement, that's more difficult with lactating cows, but here's a group of dairy heifers that the producer is providing their daily supplement of grain in a very simple homemade feeding system of plastic barrels with the ends cut off and put together with a chain. So he moves this from paddock to paddock, and the animals don't need to go back to a barn to be fed. Same thing with mineral, get that out on the pasture. Watering on pasture is another good idea. This is actually a picture of what not to do. We have single trees always attract animals, and a lot of the manure will end up getting deposited under those trees. He's compounded his problem here by putting the water right under the tree as well. So those are no-nos. And this is just it's a graph from some work Jim Garish did down in Missouri that just illustrates what I was just talking about. On this side of the graph is where the water was provided in the pasture, and then here's the distance from water across the bottom, and then at the other side of the pasture there's a shade tree. On the y-axis we have phosphorus levels in the soil, and as you can see there's a spike here by the water, and there's another spike under the shade tree. So anything you can do to move these watering sites around and avoid having a single shade tree in your pasture is going to make sure that those manure piles are spread more uniformly around the pasture. Jim did another study actually in which he looked at manure distribution in pastures, and he found that I think it was about 5 years of rotational pasture management would provide for coverage of the entire paddock surface with cow pies over that 5-year period. So it takes, this isn't an exact science, but the more uniformly you can distribute the grazing over the pasture, the more uniformly you can distribute the nutrients. So here's just a pasture diagram. As you can see, we're making the paddocks as square as possible so we don't have these tight corners like this where you're not going to get good utilization of the forage and you're not going to get a lot of nutrients distributed into those corners. So make the paddocks as square as possible, avoid these sharp angles. If possible, make water available on the paddock and feed your supplements and grains on pasture. And then here's just an example of that is simplified from our, from a management perspective and from an infrastructure perspective, but it's going to reduce the effectiveness of your nutrient distribution system. There are a lot of ways of getting water out onto the pasture with buried or above ground water lines or something like this, which I use on my own farm. It's just a running gear with a tank on it, and I can put that anywhere I want on the farm and move it, put it in a different spot every time I go into a pasture so we don't get those dirt areas and manure concentrated in any one area. Okay, and then control access to water. That's another good way of keeping the nutrients distributed effectively and not having not only losing fertility but also causing some water quality issues at the same time. And then outwintering is another practice that is fairly common in Wisconsin. I don't know how common it is in other states, but a lot of producers I know, when they do move from grazing to feeding stored forages, they try to do that on pasture, and they select areas of the farm that might be low fertility or sandy soils, low moisture holding soils, and you're actually using that practice to apply some additional fertility and organic matter to those areas. Okay, so the tools that we have for managing nutrient distribution are pasture species composition and maintaining a good legume stand, making sure we're rotating and laying out the paddock while watering and feeding on pasture as much as possible, and then the outwintering and stockpiling. So getting back to our subject at hand here, a system that includes all of these things might look something like this diagram on the screen. In this diagram, we have 3 groups of pastures designated by these green lines. Here's one, second one, and a third one. And we're going to manage each one of these groups somewhat differently. And as you can see, all of them have summer grazing on them, but we're going to take two of these sections and stockpile them starting in August. So here's our first stockpiled group of paddocks. We set them aside starting August 1st, and we're going to graze those in October, November, and maybe into December if the weather conditions allow. Our second group of paddocks, we're going to start stockpiling a little bit later and just stockpile them until winter. And these paddocks can be used to be grazed in early spring. And then the third set of paddocks will be grazed or cut for hay throughout the grazing season, grazed right up till growth stops in the fall, and they'll just be rested over the winter. So those areas, that would be a hypothetical way of laying out your pasture system. And what that does, and what producers have found that does, is help stage the growth of the pastures in the spring and help, as I mentioned early on, to spread out the growth of the pasture grasses and make it more readily utilized throughout the season. One of the challenges we have in the northern part of the country, at least, is that we have this large flush of growth in May, June time period. It represents 50 to 60% of our forage production for the year, and it's all ready at once. So how do we stage the growth so we can manage that and actually get our animals across those pastures and fully utilize that growth? Well, if we do some stockpiling in the fall and the spring, we can stage the growth of the pastures as follows. The stockpiled spring grazed paddocks that I mentioned before that are grazed in March, they go into the winter with good accumulation of root reserves because we've left them stockpiled and rested until frost. They also go through the winter protected by the fall growth. So they will come out in spring with their root reserves protected, and they should green up the earliest after we've grazed off the stockpiled forage in March. The stockpiled fall grazed paddocks have also been allowed to accumulate those root reserves until frost, but they're grazed in early winter and are left exposed over the winter. So they'll green up a little bit more slowly. And then our third group of pastures were not stockpiled in the fall. They were grazed right up until growth stopped in the winter. So they went through winter with few root reserves and no protection over the winter. So they're the ones that will green up the most slowly. So if we go back to this chart, we have these two stockpiling periods. These are grazed in the early winter. Here's the one that was grazed in March. This one is going to green up first. This group of paddocks will green up second, and this group of paddocks will green up third, and then you've staged your spring grazing so you can keep ahead of that flush of growth. Okay, one more slide. So here's just an example of how we manage our pastures on this farm using all these methods. Starting here at the top, This is a 16-acre hay field that so this starts the growing season with no grazing. We take 2 to 3 cuttings of hay, and then after the hay cutting is completed, we'll either graze this pasture in late summer, early fall, or we may stockpile it and graze it October, November time period. These pastures here are kind of our main season pastures that get grazed starting in April, May time period, and we graze them through frost. Okay, down here, these pastures are, this one here is used for outwintering, and then in the spring, we'll move our herd up into these pastures and kind of flash graze over this whole area during that early flush of growth in the spring. Meanwhile, this pasture is getting a good month or so's rest, and we come back onto this one and calve our beef cattle. When calving is over, we move them off, and then these pastures will get set aside for stockpiling later in the fall. We're able to set this aside because once we've calved, we can go back and graze these pastures throughout the season. So that's kind of how we manage the pastures on our farm. We do have certain pastures that we use for particular purposes, and the species composition in those pastures are reflective of what we use them for. The hayfield has a lot of alfalfa and orchard grass in it, so it is very effective for hay as well as for stockpiling. This outwintering pasture is the same. Okay, so that's all I have. Looks like we're right at 1:45. So in summary, stockpiling is a very effective practice that a lot of producers that use managed grazing use very effectively, especially in late fall, early winter. We can expect 1 to 2 tons of yield of dry matter per acre on those stockpiled pastures. More if we can apply some nitrogen and irrigation. The quality, I didn't find a lot of consistent data on that, but I know that producers I know here in Wisconsin can put up or have available very high quality stockpiled forage, very adequate for grazing dairy cows. Over the winter, we're going to lose both quality and yield, so I wouldn't rely on spring stockpiled pasture to provide the highest quality forage for our animals. Those spring stockpiled pastures might be more effective for dry cows or heifers or some less nutritionally high need animals. So with that, I think I'll wind up here and see if we have any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. That was great. But before we move to our Q&A period, we just like to ask you to complete a very quick poll. So how this works is you'll, each question, we have 3 questions, and each one will pop up on your screen for just a couple of seconds. And we will, here's the first one. So as a result of this webinar, do you have a better understanding about stockpiling? If you could just click on one of those responses, our participants, that would be great. And we'll do this really quickly so we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So if we could just, okay, so maybe if we can just go on to the next one. Number 2 is popping up. Will you make a change on your farm or how you advise farmers based on what you learned today? If you could just respond to that question, that would be great. Folks are voting. Wonderful. Okay, and so we will close this question. And our last question is popping up right now. Did the webinar help you learn about new resources available on stockpiling forages? If you could just click your response there, that would be great. And then we'll start accepting questions as well. Thank you very much for responding to those quick polls. So I'm just going to remind you how to pose a question. You just want to find the question box, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. And what you want to do is just type in your questions and hit return. If sometimes the question box is closed, and if that's the case, you can just click the small plus sign next to the word question to open it up. And I will be reading the questions out loud to Laura, and she'll answer as many as we have time for. As a reminder, though, if you have additional questions that we don't have time to address, you can just use our online Ask an Expert system, which is at eextension.org/ask. There's the little link right there. Okay, so the first question that came in is, are there any examples of folks doing stockpiling with goat dairies that you know of, Laura?
I'm unaware of any.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that it's not possible. I think any goat dairy that is using managed grazing could easily use this. There's no reason why they couldn't.
Okay.
I don't know a lot of, we have a fairly thriving goat dairy industry here in the state, and I don't know a lot of goat dairy folks who have mastered the fencing. So.
Right. We have a lot of browse here in our neck of the woods too. A lot of people browse.
Yeah.
Could you give an example of how to utilize stockpiling for spring grazing for an optimal mix of quality grazing in spring and early spring green up?
Can you repeat the question again?
Sure. Can you give an example of how to utilize stockpiling for spring grazing for an optimal mix of quality grazing? Maybe if you could go over how you handle it on your farm, that might be helpful for folks to hear.
Yeah, I think the spring grazing is just really challenging in this part of the world. If you have if you're farther south and you don't get as much rain and ice and snow as we do, the pasture is going to come through in a lot better condition. But I would most definitely use orchard grass or tall fescue, because what we see is that the grasses really get matted down under the snow over the winter. So those pastures going into spring are really going to be pretty low quality. And on my own farm, our cattle, they'll go out and graze because they just want to graze, after a long winter, but the feed that they're getting off of those pastures is pretty poor. So I think the best thing you can do is use those tall, upright bunch grasses, the orchard grass and the tall fescue. Your alfalfa and trefoil are just not going to make it through the winter. And then measure the quality of that forage. If you're providing it as a significant portion of your dairy cow feed, you need to know what the quality is and balance your ration with what you're getting off the pasture. Okay, I don't know if that helps, but
I think this person did a follow-up clarification. So, is it worth it to stockpile grass for the spring just to get that earlier spring green up that you had mentioned?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I'm not sure if anybody really sees enough of a difference. I mean, that the theory is there, and in a more southerly part of the country, it probably is worth it. But in the northern tier of states, I would say probably not.
Okay. I'm going to move on to a different topic. What about stockpiling or using grains? So this person is asking, what happens with winter wheat, rye, or other grains when grazed? Do you have any experience with that?
Not directly, but I know of a number of people who have, annuals in their rotations, so they're able to use small grains for grazing, and that is a very effective practice. In fact, a lot of the small grains that are grown in the southern half of the United States are grazed over the winter by cattle, mostly beef cattle. And especially in an organic crop rotation, if you've got a winter cover crop or something like that, going through and grazing those small grains before they're plowed down or planted into is, I think, would be very effective.
And to follow up on that, Laura, we have an agronomist here, Dr. Heather Darby here at the University of Vermont, and she's been looking at integrating small grains as forages. So she did give a webinar for us in April, so you could check that out on our website here. Also, she wrote an article with Mike Gamroth out of Oregon State called Strategies for Extending the Grazing Season, and I'll put the link to that up. And she does talk a little bit about fall annuals too. So I'll just put that in the little chat pod so people can have that link if they're interested.
Annuals are just kind of off topic, but annuals are a very effective part of a rotation for that kind of summer stockpiling too. I know a number of people who have taken to planting like the brown midrib sorghum Sudan grass, and there's some grazing corns, brassicas. All of those annuals can provide forage if you've got some late summer drought conditions, or for fall grazing as well.
Right, yeah, we have a fellow here that's doing Japanese millet for that summer slump too. He's been having good success with that.
Yeah.
Okay, so this person says, we're in Texas where conditions continue to be extremely dry. Any suggestions for forages that would be best suited for this part of the country?
I assume they're without irrigation down there.
She doesn't say. But there is a couple of questions about non-irrigated land.
I don't have a lot of experience with the climate conditions you have down in Texas, but I do know that there are a number of warm season grasses that are used quite a bit in the south. Like there's the native warm season grasses would be one. There's Bermuda grass. There are some actual crabgrass varieties for forages. So you'd need generally the warm season grasses that are have the C4 photosynthesis and are able to withstand the heat and dry conditions a lot better than our cool seasons do up here. Those are the ones that you'd probably want to be looking at.
Okay, and she says yes, she's correct. There's no irrigation, so.
Yeah.
Okay. Any water issues during winter stockpiling grazing?
Water meaning watering the animals?
Yeah, access to, I'm sorry, yeah, we're switching topics. So, yeah, watering the animals. I'm assuming they might mean freezing.
Yeah, and people manage that in different ways. On our farm, we've kind of limited where we outwinter to where we've installed frost-free water lines they're deep enough in the ground that they don't freeze, and then they've got some natural heating from 8 or 10 feet below ground that keep them from freezing up. But a couple of other approaches are, I know a number of dairy producers that just water at the barn, during milking, and the animals just kind of adapt and learn to drink what they need while they're there, and then they don't provide water on pasture. I know people who water it out of natural water bodies, and they basically go around and crack the ice every day. So there's it kind of depends on the setting, but there are a number of different possible options. Cattle will actually eat snow too if you've got snow on the ground. I know a few people who have had good success just having their animals rely on snow.
Okay, great. Thank you. So here's a question about when, like a timing question. So our stand is currently headed out. Should we graze a pasture right now and then start to stockpile, or should we leave the grass that is there now until later in the season? How do you manage that?
One of the things that I came across in the research was looking at the dramatic variability in forage quality. And I think that variability that I saw in the studies was based on how the pastures were managed going into the stockpiling period. So if you're looking for high quality forage, I would start by clipping or grazing off what's there now and start fresh from the ground up, so to speak. And that'll maximize your quality of the stockpile that you eventually graze in the winter. If you're going more for tonnage, then leave what's there and just add additional, let additional growth accumulate. But you're going to have, the more mature the leaves are at the time of grazing, the lower the quality is going to be.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so when we're talking about fitting stockpiling into your, your whole rotational grazing scheme or schedule, this person's asking, are you talking about a combination of rotational grazing plus harvesting, or a separate area for rotational grazing from harvesting baled forages? I think they're trying to ask, how does stockpiling fit into the whole rotational grazing system? I think
well,
it goes back to what you were just talking about, perhaps.
Yeah, at the very end, the diagram of my own property is there were areas that we both grazed and cut for hay. There are areas that were both grazed during the season and used for stockpiling. And I think I see that on most of the managed grazing farms I visit, and in the surveys we've done of producers here in the state anyway, about a third of the pastures on any particular farm are also used for hay cutting. So, and that's kind of one of the key ways of managing that spring flush and making sure you've got feed for the year. If you mechanically harvest part of your pastures when you've got that 50 or 60% of the growth coming on and feed that back in the winter, you can even out the pasture need over the course of the season. So I think the key would be to select, the right proportion of your pastures and use some of those acres for hay cutting for part of the year, use some of those acres for stockpiling in the fall, and use some of them, probably all of them, for grazing more or less during the main grazing season. And under ideal conditions, you would move around which pastures you use for what, because we've found in the research that the productivity of the pastures is actually increased if it's not managed the same year after year, if you kind of mix things up and cut hay in some areas and not in others. So that's the ideal. It's not the easiest thing to practice on the farm, though.
This question kind of relates to what you just said. It says, what about using stockpiling to improve lower quality pastures? And then they had also said, so using stockpiling, longer rest, and manure application to improve lower quality pastures for dry cow grazing. Just to add a little specific.
Yeah, then, I don't know of any research that has looked at that, but I do know that, I mean, there are folks that use outwintering and a longer rest period for exactly that purpose, because what we find is when you routinely graze a paddock once every 21 to 30 days or 45 days, basically the root growth you can think of as being about the same volume as the top growth. So if you give a pasture a longer rest and you build up more volume of green leaves, you're actually allowing the root system to extend further and to grow more. So anytime you can give a pasture a longer rest, that's probably going to help the overall fertility and productivity of the pasture.
Okay, great. Here's a question about no-till. So is there any reason you would not be able to use no-till methods with stockpiling?
I guess I can't think of any reason. I'm not sure if the person is asking about interseeding into an existing pasture or establishing the pasture for the first time. Mm-hmm. But I know that the August time frame is probably the best time in the northern part of the country anyway for establishing pastures. You have a lot less weed pressure and that sort of thing. So, and no-till practices would be very compatible with that. I know a lot of people also use a no-till drill if you're interseeding into a pasture to increase legume content. That's more frequently done in the spring, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the person just said, yes, can I interseed a grazed field?
Mm-hmm. The interseeding is generally much more effective with legumes. We don't see a lot of good establishment of grasses into a mature existing sod, and that's interseeding legumes is much more effective in the spring as well, just to get them a good start. And if you seed as early as you can in the spring, then the grasses aren't growing as vigorously, and they're off to a good start. I don't know of a lot of people who try that in the fall in connection with stockpiling. Mm-hmm.
Can you discuss windrows as a season extender and how that relates to stockpiling in the fall?
I know that that's a fairly common practice west of here, in Nebraska and the Dakotas and Iowa, that area. And I'm not really sure what the advantage of that is over stockpiling and letting the cattle harvest the material themselves, except that you might get a little bit better utilization of windrowing. And you might want to, if you're doing windrowing, you might want to look at using a more of a hayfield type mix that would have more alfalfa in it. Not sure what the circumstances would be that would be more effective than simply stockpiling and letting the animals harvest it themselves.
Okay, fair enough. This person was curious about how much of your pastures are irrigated.
None. It's not a very common practice in the Midwest or the East, I don't think, but it's we're seeing a little bit more of it now, and a lot of people are looking at some of the there's some portable irrigation equipment that you can do about 10 acres or 5 acres at a time and then move it from one pasture to another. So it's getting more common, but I think you'd need, it seems like it's the infrastructure costs are better accommodated by a dairy system that is generating more income than a beef producer usually does.
And again, there's different species, maybe different plant species too. Like I had mentioned the Japanese millet for the summer slump, and you had mentioned some species that will tolerate droughty conditions.
Yeah, and that's a good way of addressing those summer drought conditions. And really, if you think about summer stockpiling, once you've gotten past the reproductive growth and the heading out of the grasses, and you get everything clipped, which happens mid-June or so, mid to late June, then the rest of the season you've got vegetative growth on most of your species, relatively high quality. And you can actually, if you have the acreage, stockpile or set aside pastures, and they'll hold their quality fairly well, for a drought period later in the summer.
Well, great. I think that's all the questions we have in the question box. Any final words of wisdom, Laura?
Can't think of any. I appreciate the opportunity, and I think one of the things with this whole pasture movement is that we all learn a lot from each other, and every time I go out on a farm here in Wisconsin, I learn something new. We've got a bunch of very creative, innovative folks out there who are adapting these practices to their own farms. So I welcome people's comments and thoughts. I always learn something from others' input as well.
Well said. So I'd like to thank our participants for joining us. If you do have questions that come up after you hang up the phone or the computer, you can just a reminder you can ask them at that website, www.eextension.org/ask. And as I mentioned before, this webinar is a part of an ongoing series, and we are just lining up our fall-winter series webinars now. So stay tuned for those. And until then, you can find an archive of today's session, which includes Laura's article and a PDF of her slides, a recording of all of our other webinars, as well as articles, videos, and more at eextension.org/organic_production. Laura, thank you very, very much for joining us today, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.